Soyez les bienvenus, une fois de plus. Welcome to you all. Alors, je vais d'abord commencer par vous demander, je vais vous poser la même question à chacun d'entre vous. L'autonomie stratégique de l'Afrique, vous l'envisagez comment et qu'est-ce que cela signifie pour vous en termes concrets? Je vais commencer avec vous, Monsieur Boulouma. Bien sûr. L'autonomie stratégique de l'Afrique, vous l'envisagez comment? Et en des termes concrets, qu'est-ce que cela signifie pour vous?
Thank you for the opportunity. I must say that I'm very delighted to be part and parcel of this gathering of great minds that represent the greatness of our soil here in Africa. In Kenya, I am the head of the Kenya Young Parliamentarians Association, which is a platform for young members of parliament. And maybe just to dive to the question at hand, I want to pick this from a quote that was given by Albert Einstein, who was a highly celebrated physicist and scientist. And he observed that the significant problems that are faced in this world can never and will never be solved by the same thinking that caused the problem. So this one boils from the very thinking that as Africans we've been poisoned with. Because I followed through all our conversations and contributions. They all rotate around problems imposed by the West. They all rotate around challenges imposed by the West. But I want to disagree. I feel like part of it is also African shared, because we have allowed ourselves to buy into poisoned narratives that do not necessarily reflect who we are. And this is practical in this sense. For example, the model used in terms of measuring wealth of nations is a model that was not entirely African. It was designed to project the West as being very wealthy because they use GDP, which focuses on issues outside natural capital. If we were to, for example, remodel and say, for example, let's measure the global wealth on the account of natural capital and resources, do you think we'd be talking of Africa the same? I think we'd be the wealthiest continent. We will actually be the wealthy countries bragging across the globe. So for a start, we must, first of all, disabuse narratives that have been imposed on us. We must disagree with the publications that are foreign in nature and are talking about Africa, because that's the foundation to the problems that bedevil us. Our parliaments are prisons. Prisons because of infiltration. And our memberships have been invaded and poisoned with the Western thinking to believe that the only thing that can work in Africa has to be borrowed from the West. Hence the reason why we are struggling with these challenges of debt, because we are only responding to their strategies, the Bretton Woods strategies. And once their strategies are clear, they impose it on us. So if we want to create a strategy, we create it based on their script. So I strongly believe that the autonomy we are looking for in our parliaments, in our spaces of leadership, must start by, first of all, Africans re-examining the knowledge we have about ourselves, Africans re-examining the literature that has been written about us, and then building on the foundation of a paradigm shift in our thinking. Then we can begin to now properly address these challenges that we are talking about. Because, like I said, for us to actually emancipate ourselves completely, it will not just wait for us to break down the shackles that have been put on us physically. It must, and they say the colonialists left physically, but they left their presence mentally. So we must disabuse the literature, the thinking that has been imposed on us, and begin to reimagine Africa afresh. And somebody pointed out that one of the conversations that came out from the country-specific discussions was on how are we preparing the next generation for Africa. Because yes, we are all gathered. A lot of us probably are aging, but are we doing enough to prepare the next generation of leaders of Africa to... Yes, yes. Thank you.
I don't want you to say everything right now. Let's pace ourselves because I know that you have a lot to say on that topic. Keyword here, wait. How long are we going to wait? I think that was very important. And truly, there is nothing to wait. We are the change that we're waiting for. So thank you very much. Mrs. Mukumba, I'd like to ask you the same question, please. What does that... Qu'est-ce que cela vous inspire, cette autonomie stratégique?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. So I think for me, it will require a two-prong approach. Over the past 2-3 days, we've been having conversations about what we need to do in order to address this debt situation. And so this conversation has been happening at 2 levels. There has been a discussion about what we need to do domestically, the type of inward-looking introspection that we need to do, right? So looking at our political systems, looking at our legislation, looking at issues such as corruption, etc. And that's absolutely an important element of this work. But I think what is equally important and must happen at the same time is the continued pushback against what's happening within the international financial architecture. I'm currently at present reading sort of 2 books, one of them being this one that AfCoDD is so kindly sharing with us, as well as another one written by Martin Meredith on the state of Africa. And as I was reading the 2 books, it was interesting because what was quite striking was round about the time when the Bretton Woods Conference was happening, at the other side of the world, in the late 1940s, a gentleman named Sir Charles Arden Clarke was having sleepless nights because there was a troublesome prisoner who essentially was causing him problems. This prisoner named Kwame Nkrumah, right? And the reason he was causing him problems was because he'd started this political party that had the motto, self-governance now. And for me, that was so striking because there were conversations about the development of the international financial architecture and the rules that need to govern that, whilst we were still trying to figure out who we were. So because we weren't part and parcel of those decisions, they are highly skewed outside of us, and so we need to continuously be pushing back for the overhaul of those institutions, whilst at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, we're also doing the introspective work of looking at what do we need to do internally as well to make sure that we aren't, in a sense, I guess one would say cutting ourselves at our knees, right? So it requires a multi-pronged approach in order to reach the autonomy you're talking about.
Thank you very much. Very beautifully said. And I now turn to you, Mr. Bomba. What is your take on this?
Good morning. I'm never very comfortable speaking whilst I'm seated. So this is the home of Codestria. It's the home of Sheikh Anta Diop. It's the home of Trust Africa. It's the home of Aikwe Ama. And our founding chairperson here is Opa. And there's a lot of intellectuals in the house, public intellectuals. So I don't think we are out of space. If we at least take a few steps on the intellectual terrain and engage really deeply in terms of ideas around the questions that you are putting before us. And I think the starting point for me is a correct characterization of the moment. We've had it since day one, but a few things bear re-emphasis. It's an unprecedented moment of crisis, maybe the deepest crisis in a generation. It's a multifaceted crisis. It manifests on the economic front, it manifests on the political front, it manifests on the climate front, it manifests on the democracy and governance front. It's an all-encompassing crisis. We've never met such levels of uncertainty as humanity as we currently confront today. But what's important, I think, is to understand that in this particular case, we are talking of crisis in a very classical sense of saying we've gone beyond what we could call a problem, something that you can resolve at the same level of thinking or within the same paradigms of thought that have already existed. For a crisis of the magnitude we are talking about, we are talking of having to think outside the box and really having to put forward radical ideas that can provide a line of sight for humanity, maybe for the next 50 to 100 years. I think when we say crisis, we are saying that the anchor idea that has defined the world, that has created what we are calling the world order in this conversation has become exhausted. It no longer has energy, it no longer has solutions to answer humanity's biggest challenges of the day on all these fronts: politics, economics, climate, society, across the board. So what's required in a very big sense is a new anchor idea that can move us forward. And this is the context within which we are asking the question: how can Africa exercise strategic autonomy in this particular moment? It's a question easier asked than answered, because I think for you to be a rule maker, as AfCoDD is encouraging us, it's not just a matter of raising your voice. It's not just a moral question to say we are also human beings, we exist, we are 1 billion of us, we are in Africa. It's a question of power. World orders throughout human history have always been defined by the most powerful. The current world order that is collapsing, for all intents and purposes, is an American-defined world order. It was defined at the end of the Second World War, and America had 80% of the global currency at that point, 50% of the global economy, the most powerful military in the world. So that's why the IMF, the World Bank are headquartered in Washington, D.C., and the UN is in New York, and the US dollar is the reserve currency of the world. They were the most powerful country at that moment, and they defined this world order. We are at a moment where we are saying it's crumbling. And I think a quick answer to your question is to then say, as Africa, we need to think about how do we build ourselves into a power so that we have a right to sit on the table. Putin is an extremely cynical person. He recently said the fight that's playing out globally is an extremely brutal fight. And it's a fight that requires only those who are sovereign to sit around the table. And then those who are not sovereign will be split amongst the sovereigns. So we are back to the Berlin Conference moment. There's a whole new scramble for Africa. It is not guaranteed. We cannot claim the guarantee that we'll be able to sit and define this world order. We need to build ourselves into a power. It means engaging on the terrain of ideas, and much more specifically, engaging around the definition of the political system at the global order, the economic system at the global order, and we've got a lot of things that we can share in terms of deepening the question that you have put before us. Let me leave it at that for now. Thank you.
And it's true, at the end of the day, we cannot keep on doing the same things and expect a different outcome. And it's not necessarily the one who speaks the louder that is the most heard. So thank you very much. This is very powerful. Je vais repasser au français. pour revenir vers vous. Monsieur Boulouma, vous avez commencé à nous en parler tout à l'heure. Vous êtes très actif au niveau de la jeunesse. Alors, les jeunes Africains représentent environ 70% de la population totale du continent. Plus de 200 millions d'Africains, en fait, ont entre 15 et 24 ans. Et ce chiffre devrait même doubler d'ici les 20 prochaines années. Autre chiffre très impressionnant, mais un petit peu quand même cynique, eh bien, les jeunes représentent 60% de l'ensemble des chômeurs sur le continent. Alors, Monsieur Boulouma, j'aimerais vous demander comment faire pour que cette jeunesse ne devienne pas une bombe à retardement et comment est-ce que vous les aidez à votre niveau à mieux comprendre et à gérer les crises?
I would point out a few things. One, there has been a call for African unity. Unity of purpose, unity of economics, and even political federation, if possible. I think that's one way of actually consolidating Africans, so as for us to gain the kind of strength that we need to deal with challenges such as the youth time bomb and the opportunities thereof. My own thinking is that for us to be able to consolidate, because what exists, and sometimes we are careful not to say this, is because amongst ourselves, sometimes there's a level of insecurity whereby you feel like if I trade with a Tanzanian, if I trade with a Ghanaian, probably either one of us is shortchanging the other. There is a level of insecurity that denies us from dealing with each other. So for us to be able to inculcate a new culture that allows us to work as one people, we must begin to put measures that allow us to start working together. I'll give you a practical example of what we are doing as parliamentarians. Kenya has the Association of Young Parliamentarians, which I had. So around 2020, at one of our convening in Addis, with other like-minded parliamentarians from other countries, we sat as young parliamentarians and said that the challenges facing our youth are somewhat related. And for us to be able to address them, we need to consolidate our voice and champion for youth issues as one voice within the continent. And now we have created amongst ourselves an African network that we are calling the Africa Young Parliamentarians Network. This network is intended to allow us to start talking to each other, sharing strategies. Like, for example, in the Kenyan context, we did introduce a policy within our government system that sets aside all 30% of government procurement opportunities to go to young people, women, and persons with disability. Another country can borrow that idea. South Africa could be implementing a better economic program that Kenya can learn from it. So what I'm driving at is that the first thing is for Africans to learn from each other. We start there so that we don't have to learn everything from the West. We learn from each other, solve our problems, create homegrown solutions from amongst ourselves. After we do that, we must also be able to enhance intra and inter-African trading. Intra and inter-African trading will allow us to also allow our people to be economically empowered. I'll give you an example. Yesterday, in just one of the social gathering after this meeting, me and some brothers from, I think, Zimbabwe and other places, we just gathered in one of the rooms and we were catching up. And while we were just talking amongst ourselves as young people, an opportunity arose. One of the colleagues or comrades from another country told me, can I be able to do some kind of trade with your country? And I was very willing to help link that colleague with the opportunities in Kenya. It means Africans, when we talk to each other, when we work together, we get solutions together. We need to also encourage the creation of economic blocks that will enable us to have a better negotiating power. Because what we have today is a competing Africa, whereby if today China came to Kenya and they want to do some kind of trading with us, and we find their terms very unfavorable, the obvious thing they will do is walk to our neighboring country, Uganda, and give them the same offer. So if Uganda takes it up, it means it has weakened the Kenyan voice. But if we have a common bloc that allows us to negotiate as one entity, then it means that anybody who comes to Africa to do business with Africa has to come through the African strategy. And I think the African strategy will have the African solution to youth unemployment and ultimately solve the bulging youth population, because that is not a problem. It should not even be perceived as a time bomb. It's supposed to be an opportunity, because a bulging youth population means bulging energy, bulging labor force, bulging talent, bulging opportunities. And the new thinking must accommodate that kind of a narrative. Yeah.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much for that. Effectivement, c'est assez quand même poignant quand on entend que le Bénin a une très très belle économie du coton. Notre collègue ici tout à l'heure nous en a parlé. Et le continent continue d'importer des vêtements de seconde main de l'Europe et de partout ailleurs, des vêtements de seconde main qui polluent l'environnement, notamment au Ghana. C'est 65 millions de tonnes de vêtements qui arrivent comme ça des quatre coins du monde, alors que l'on pourrait s'habiller en coton africain. Donc effectivement, plus de collaboration. Alors avant de passer à vos copanélistes, Monsieur Boulouma, j'aimerais vous demander encore une autre question. Vous donc, qui parlez à ces jeunes des quatre coins du continent, de quoi rêvent-ils? Quel est leur rêve commun?
I think the hope of Africa is that one day we will be able to stand up as a strong continent that is living up the full potential that we have. Because we are a continent endowed with so much wealth in terms of our natural capital, in terms of ideas. If you look at the drivers of even technology across the globe, are Africans. Today, it was a young Kenyan who introduced what we call the M-Pesa, which is a mobile transaction platform that is being utilized across the globe. It was an African concept. So what these young Africans aspire is to live in a continent that gives them an opportunity to be the best they can be. And for that to happen, it means that we must get it right on leadership. Getting it right on leadership does not necessarily mean that we have to borrow everything that was taught to us as the right model of leadership. But we must also allow ourselves to imagine what works for Africa in terms of leadership. They want to live in a continent that recognizes they have talents, they have skills that need to be developed and nurtured. And most importantly, they want to live in a continent that they must be taught to love, not to hate.
And to live.
And to live, yes.
Unfortunately, et parfois au péril de leur vie. Merci beaucoup. Madame Mukumba, je me tourne à présent vers vous. Alors, pour reprendre les propos de la vice-présidente générale des Nations Unies, Madame Amina Mohamed, le monde n'est pas dans une crise de ressources, mais dans une crise de partage. J'ai trouvé ça vraiment très fort. Alors, pour un système fiscal plus équitable, le groupe Afrique a obtenu récemment une résolution historique à l'ONU pour un système de coopération fiscale internationale. Alors, j'aimerais vous demander, Madame, est-ce que ceci est le signe que le continent commence à se faire entendre, et concrètement, qu'est-ce que cette résolution va changer?
You're absolutely right. I think we are starting to see a shift within the global financial architecture. And you're even increasingly starting to see these international financial institutions that Briggs was referring to also recognize that there's a problem, right? That these institutions are no longer fit for purpose. So as far as the tax conversation is concerned, TGNA, alongside institutions such as the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, the Financing for Development Forum, have long argued for a multilateral agreement where we can tackle issues of tax abuse, tax havens, illicit financial flows, the taxation of multinational corporations within an intergovernmental process at the United Nations, a space that also allows for the participation of rights holders. This is something that we've been calling for as long as TGNA has been around, and then last year saw a historic decision being made. Historic in the sense that it marked the beginning of the the way in which former colonial powers have long dominated conversations on international tax. And so in response to your question, what do we think has been one of the success factors? I think if you ask anybody, the response will be different. But I think for me, what I would say has been a success factor has been the continued, dogged, resolute determination of global South countries, and at present being led by the African group, to push back against underdevelopment. And underdevelopment, as was defined by OPA 2 days ago, being the systems, the forces, the institutions that are seeking to maintain the status quo, where we have that relationship of countries that are at the center and then countries that are at the periphery. And so in a sense, that is what I think has been one of the contributing factors to this. The current global tax system that we exist in has been in place for the past 100 years. Our countries were not at play. As I mentioned, many of our leaders were in fact fighting for their freedom, fighting for the political independence of our countries. And so as you can imagine, the current global tax rules are skewed in the favor of developed countries. Despite this, as soon as developing countries, as global South countries were able to participate in these forums, they started to ask for reform. They started to ask for an overhaul of these global tax systems. In the tax space in the 1940s, representatives from North and South America tabled a draft that essentially was to start to request for a looking at the allocation of taxing rights, of taxing revenues, but also the establishment of an international tax organization. As you can imagine, but of no surprise to anybody, this gained no traction because there was no support from the United States and from the United Kingdom, and so in 1946, this was rejected. Despite this, global South countries have continued to push for reform. Whether it is countries from Latin America, whether it is the G77 and China, whether it is other global South coalitions, they've continued to push, and eventually the status quo, the institutions that are currently maintaining where we are now, could no longer act as though this push is not being requested for. And that's how we found ourselves at the end of last year with this historic decision that essentially is marking the beginning of the reform of the global tax system. So, of course, conversations about the upending of the tax system have been happening much longer than the conversation about the reform of the debt system. But I would say, for me, that's really been something that we've seen as a major contributing factor towards at least the tax system component of the discussion about reforming the global international financial architecture.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup, Madame Mukumba. Monsieur Bomba, je me tourne à présent vers vous à nouveau. Alors, vous êtes engagé depuis de nombreuses années contre la mauvaise gestion financière et fiscale, notamment des flux illicites financiers. Alors, pensez-vous que nous nous sommes finalement habitués à un système de développement extractif qui perpétue l'endettement, la dépendance, le sous-développement? Et d'après vous, comment faire pour atteindre cette autonomie stratégique?
And last time that I stand up, right? Yeah, so I think it's important that we maintain our flight a little bit, or cruising at this level of, so what is the big framework that can help us answer the questions that you are putting forward? I always say moments of crisis like this are moments that call for leadership, not management. It calls for leaders even, not necessarily managers, because leaders is, again, knowing the right thing to do, defining the right thing to do, and management is, doing things right. So we could be on the Titanic, we're about to hit an iceberg, we can spend our time focusing on, for fine dining, you put the fork on the left, the knife on the right, but we'll hit into an iceberg. We need to avoid this iceberg. And I think that's the task before us. So at one level, it's a question of what needs to happen on the political front, reforming the UN system, because it's a key feature of the current global order, is important, so that we sit at the table, even at a political level, before we start to get to some of the economic issues that Chennai is bringing in. Africa must have permanent seats at the United Nations. We can't just be invited guests going in there. Then most importantly, the question is really about the net transfer of wealth from the continent to the global north. That is the perennial question that we are dealing with. And it's a result of currently the injustices in the global financial architecture that Chennai had started to touch on. The question of global tax cooperation needs to be completely redefined. When it was first posed, the objective was to avoid double taxation of multinational corporations. If you actually go, that's the text that you find now. What we are saying today, the objective of global tax cooperation must be to stop illicit financial flows, as you said, maximize domestic resources mobilization, and generate enough resources that can allow us to invest in addressing the major challenges that we are facing as humanity today, on climate, on politics, on governance, on youth, on all of these issues. So we need to completely redefine these things. And the way the rules were set was such that as African countries, basically we're not sitting around the table. That's why I'm completely aligned with AfCoDD when they say Africa as a rule maker. We're not sitting around the table. We did not define those rules. We just took those rules. They were defined in very specific terms. We would tax on profits that multinational corporations make. The global north, capital exporting countries would tax on return on investment. And then there's base erosion and profit shifting, so these companies can sit in your country for 20 years and not declare a single cent in profit. This is reality, it's not fictional. So we are not getting anything out of it. So it's very important, if we are thinking about curtailing illicit financial flows, that we invest in this conversation about reforming, restructuring the global financial architecture so that we address the injustices that are inherent in that and create a new system that will ensure that finally Africa benefits from the wealth of resources that it has. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm actually going to jump right back to you, Mr. Buluma, talking about changing things, including not repeating the errors of the past. What are you doing with the youth to make sure that they don't copy what's been done?
Thank you. Hello? Good. Thank you. I think what is happening across Africa, there is an awakening amongst young people. There is a consciousness towards creating solutions for ourselves. Because for far too long, many young people have been at the periphery, watching things and events unfold. But youth are no longer sitting on the periphery. They are coming right at the table. And we will start with Africa, because we know that we have solutions for Africa. And some of the measures that we want to put in place is first consolidate our voice at the country level and then at the regional level. In Kenya, for example, the whole reason why we created this caucus was to have that awakening in terms of youth consciousness amongst the Kenyan young people. So as for us to showcase what leadership looks like. And then after we've done that, we now move the conversation to the African continent. But even as we do it, we can sense South Africa doing the same. We can sense Uganda doing the same. We can sense other countries, African countries, doing the same. Therefore, that's the beginning of change, because we operate on the conviction that the freedom we pursue will never be given voluntarily by those oppressing Africa. We must demand for those freedom, and we must get it. If they create tables and they want to sit amongst themselves, if we are not part of that table, it is our duty to destroy the table and create another one. We must be as radical as we can, because it's no longer business as usual. For far too long, they have made us believe we are inferior, despite the fact that we are the owners of the global wealth. They have made us believe that we don't belong, we are not as intelligent, whereas we know the most intelligent people are found in Africa, you know? So we are coming to basically manifest our strength and our capacity in this global arena.
Well, yeah, business as usual is bad business for us, so yeah, it has to change. Thank you very much to you three for such powerful messages today. We've got about 10 minutes for questions in the audience. We'd love to hear from you. As Mr. Bomba said, we are in the company of so many intellectuals and people who have got a lot to say. Sir, there with the black shirt, and then the lady at the back, please. Can a member of the team bring their... Yes, and we have 3 people. Wonderful. If someone could take a microphone to them, please. Thank you for introducing yourself as well when you ask a question. Or if you want to come here, I can... Oh, there's a microphone coming.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. And thank you, the panelists. My young brother is saying that I've been talking too much. Yes, indeed, we need to talk. Because after we've talked, we can act. And we can act very well the way our young brother is saying. I am Martin Sunke from Africa Development Interchange Network, coming from Cameroon. I want you to consider a figure. I'm sure many of us have never considered this. 29%. Do you know what this means? Africa represents 29% in terms of UN member states. Have you ever considered this? No. And I will come back to the first question that Madam Moderator asked the panelists about, can we, how did you put it? Can we be African?
Autonomous strategy.
Autonomous strategy. Yes, madam, we can do that. And I think that's what our young brother is saying. We could close our borders and say, okay, we come back to where we were before colonization. That is, Africa was known by no one. And then we start doing things in Africa for our own, on our own and for us. And then we stop sending our natural resources outside. Do you know what will happen? We are not the ones who will suffer. People out there will be in trouble. And I'm sure they will come and trigger war with us. Because life will be no more possible with them. So I think that's the kind of radical strategy that we have to adopt. Africa should come back home and see how to sweep the house, live in that house, forget about the outside, and get people outside that know that we are strong. Because we are the richest continent, madam. We have all what other people need. Let me bring it just back to cocoa. Do you know another place where they grow cocoa? Yes, there's another place where they grow cocoa. If you take the cocoa that is grown in South America, that will not be enough to feed these people outside there. They will still need to come here in Africa. Because when you take Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, and Cameroon, they produce more than...
I think it's 80% of all the cocoa consumed in the world.
You see? And yes. Cocoa is something that people like outside there. When are we sit and say, okay, look, you outside there, before you get your chocolate, you have to come and kneel down here in Africa. That's the kind of strategy we need to be having. So
thank you.
And the COVID-19 came to give us a lesson that we can close our borders and still be alive. Because we did that for 3 months, and this is Africa still alive. But the thing is, we kept thinking that we are the weakest. No, we are not the ones who are suffering. I mean, who need the others. The others need us more than we need them.
Talking about COVID-19, actually, sorry to interrupt you. I was in London at the time. I stayed there during the whole time. And working at the BBC, we were expecting for high levels, numbers of deaths in Africa. We were preparing for that. And then we realized that people were dying in Europe, in America, and not so much in Africa. And so thank you very much for that lesson, in fact. And it forced us to, yes.
So to conclude, we need
Thank you.
to implement our continental free trade area.
Thank you
And then
so
we
much.
need to forget about people outside coming to help us. Nobody comes to help us. Thank you.
We are the change that we need. Lady there in the back, please. We've got about 8 minutes, please. Thank you. Then, yes.
Thank you. I will be very quick.
Thank you so much.
So, my name is Namote from Zambia, Lusaka, from Consumer Unity and Trust Society. I have a question for the young parliamentarian from Kenya. You mentioned you're engaging a lot with young people. I just wanted to find out, what are some of the strategies that you're using in order for us young people who are innovators to be able to have intellectual property rights? I know in Zambia we had one entrepreneur who actually came up with a vehicle that is able to detect if the car is a smart car, I should say. However, unfortunately, due to intellectual property rights, it's been a little bit difficult for him to navigate around. So I just wanted to find out, what are some of the ways that you're using to inform young people to know about their intellectual property rights as they're innovating these different innovations that will help promote, obviously, the economic development and also as well promoting the origin of certificate for us Africans. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a really good question.
Thank you for the question. Part of the new African story is honesty. And there is nothing specific we've done in respect to this, because we are starting from a political conversation point of view. Once we are able to consolidate the political voice, then we can begin to co-create, say, legislations that are cross-cutting and can be able to get to our parliaments. Like, for example, the convening that I was talking about was informed by the concerns as young Africans we had about issues of corruption. So we convened to try and understand, is there a role we can play as young parliamentarians in our respective jurisdictions to help deal with the issue of corruption? And our conclusion was that one avenue is through the creation of the whistleblower protection laws. So Kenya is in the process of enacting that law, and so are other countries doing the same. But it's an issue that I recognize is fundamental, because many young people have been deprived of their potential because of this particular issue. I mentioned the example of the young man who invented in Kenya what we call the M-Pesa. He was almost suffering that particular fate, save for the fact that there was uproar and people got concerned and lawyers coalesced around this young man, and he was able to at least negotiate his way into wealth. So it's a timely issue that requires the collective intervention from not just the young parliamentarians, but also actors who have interest in strengthening the potential of young people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was such a powerful question, because we know that our continent is so creative and its youth is so creative. Did you know, for instance, that Togo was in 2019 the country in the world with the most female inventors? And unfortunately, those women inventors and other young inventors, in fact, were not able to get their property rights recognized. And what happens is that very often they get discouraged, and we lose so much talent like that. So indeed, this is a very important question to address. And not talking about the music and the arts field, there's such a wealth of resources and talent that's being lost there. So very quickly, I would like to go to the back of the room and then to Mr. there with the black, yes. So Mr. over there with the beautiful blue ensemble, let's say. And then we'll go to, okay, so we'll do, all right. So the microphone was, il a été détourné, mais on ira à vous derrière.
Thank you. Just to come back a bit to the arguments and the way we have shaped it in terms of
we can't hear you.
concluding. I think what is clear, we have had, first, ideas. Thank you, Comrade Briggs. Ideas matters. We need to come back to that space where we also use African ideas. We put it in the realm or the phrase of contestation. Very correct. And we need to continue to do that indeed we have ideas that can move, change, in terms of the rules. First point, what I've had in the last 3 days still resonates with what we, I think, in agreement to do, which is that we need to come together more as a people. When I hear the point about we are reached there, what are we not doing there, the young parliamentarians that are beginning to connect and all of that, it speaks to our integration. How much of it are we ready to drive? A common currency, integration issue to drive. I think in terms of the message we should take away from here, our work more on our integration, we should really drive it seriously. And when we talk about it on the issue of integration, our comrade who gave us the lecture, Comrade Opa, talked about the question of old and new ideas, finding contestations, and the need to move forward with what we think should represent rules for Africa. I would say we need to address the issue of our sovereignty. The way we act, the brother talked about cotton in Benin, and then the sister said we are still importing fairly used clothes. It's to the extent to which we recognize how much of it we can do things together when it is Africa. Not to talk of the fact that we use visas across our borders still, that lamentable situation. Mm-hmm. But lastly, is the issue of framing. If we live here, what message should we take? And I think the message, we should frame the message in a way that it will be very inclusive. It will bring our people together, and it will give our people hope. That if we continue to do this, the change we seek, we will achieve. And I will say to AfCoDD that the message from this space should go round for our people to hear. And first, for me, the first message is enough of the stealing of our minerals. If Niger today is speaking up, we should stand with Niger. We know the crisis, why Niger is being targeted. Enough of the stealing of the mineral. The message should be, for me, let's redefine, in terms of internal resource generation, let's renegotiate our mining licenses. The African mining vision can't be lying fallow without us doing something about it. The way we have mining contract that have, led us to perpetual slavery, let's have the courage to renegotiate this mining license.
Thank you very much. And very lastly to Dr. Diagne, right at the back, and then we'll conclude. Thank you very much for your contribution, sir.
Merci beaucoup. Alors moi, j'aimerais apporter juste une contribution très rapidement. Donc c'était sur la question de l'emploi des jeunes. C'est une question qui est très, très importante et qui est à la limite même stressante. À chaque fois qu'on voit le nombre de jeunes qui arrivent sur le marché de l'emploi, c'est une question en tout cas qui est souvent posée au pouvoir public en termes d'absorption, alors que ce qu'il faut comprendre, c'est que en fait, c'est pas le gouvernement en fait ne peut pas absorber toute la masse qui arrive en fait tous les ans sur le marché du travail. En revanche, le rôle du gouvernement, c'est de mettre en place les conditions pour que le secteur privé puisse s'épanouir et puisse donc créer de la richesse et créer de l'emploi pour ces jeunes qui arrivent sur le marché. Donc, travailler sur l'environnement des affaires, de sorte à ce que, par exemple, en termes de taxation, que ce ne soit pas trop lourd pour les entreprises, que les entreprises puissent également accéder au financement pour développer leur activité, etc. Donc des actions peuvent être entreprises dans ces différents domaines, de sorte à pouvoir jouer pleinement la partie, que le secteur privé en tout cas soit suffisamment fort pour pouvoir donc absorber cette masse-là. Parce que la fonction publique, il faut le préciser, en tout cas pour le cas du Sénégal, c'est 130 000 employés. Donc à côté, vous avez des centaines de milliers de jeunes qui arrivent tous les ans sur le marché du travail. Donc ça, c'était une contribution que je voulais apporter. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, Dr Diagne. Et c'est une très grande contribution, hein, comme on l'a mentionné au début. Les jeunes représentent 60% quand même des chômeurs sur le continent et ce nombre ne fait qu'augmenter. Et comme les panélistes l'ont mentionné, malheureusement, si on ne trouve pas des solutions pour eux, si on ne rend pas le continent agréable et porteur d'opportunités pour eux, eh bien, ils prendront le risque, malheureusement, de partir, de traverser la Méditerranée. Et on sait très bien comment cela se termine parfois. Voilà donc qui nous mène à la fin de notre passionnante discussion aujourd'hui. J'aimerais vous remercier tous les trois une fois de plus et je vais vous lancer un petit challenge avant de partir. On résume la conversation en un mot-clé aujourd'hui. Pour vous, quel est le mot-clé à retenir de cette conversation? Et je vais commencer, je sais, c'est pas facile, mais je vais commencer d'ailleurs avec vous, Monsieur Bomba. Un mot-clé à retenir.
Ideas, knowledge, a critical terrain of struggle.
Perfect. So let's keep it more realistic. 3 keywords, please.
Oh, I don't know. Those are not my 3 words. Can I make it an idea? Sorry, I failed poorly. I think for me, just based off of a conversation I was having with a few people yesterday, we need to preserve the conversations that have started here and the space we've created. Because I think the minute we actually start to gain traction, we are going to come against so much pushback. We're going to come against forces that want to dismantle this. So if I was to give one word, I would say preserve. I think that's what I would say to AfCoDD.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Unity, purpose, and vision.
Lovely. Lovely. Thank you very much. Merci. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much.